This is lecture 5.1, and in here we're going to talk about the cultural impacts of poverty. In this lecture, we are going to do a little case study of my hometown. We're going to talk about some popular conceptions of poverty, and then we are also going to talk about some cultural level expectations of poverty. So my hometown is a really good example of a place that prospered a long time ago, but now is really deeply riddled with poverty. It's also a very good example of what rural poverty looks like. If we look at the racial breakdown of Leechburg, Pennsylvania, we really see kind of what a very poor rural place looks like. In the United States, on average in the year, in the early 2020s, we have 60% of the population being white, 13% of the population being African American, 18% being Latinx, and 6% being Asian. Now, this isn't maybe necessarily absolutely obvious to those of us that haven't spent way too much time looking at demographics, but if you look at the demographics of the country, in places that prosper the most, it looks more like that kind of breakdown. The main reason there being that that's what the numbers look like in places in the United States where people want to be, right? Where people want to go to get jobs. Basically, diversity is tied to opportunity because people move into an area when there are jobs there. If we compare this to Leechburg, 98% of the population is white, 1.2% is African American, and 0.17% is Native American, and 0.04% is Asian. And if you do the math on that one, that's one person. This indicates that there has not been an influx in the population in that town since about the 1930s, really, when the population of the country was in the 90s in terms of white people. This is just kind of a geographic breakdown of where we're talking about. We are about 45 minutes away from Pittsburgh, and basically the town itself, I mean, it's kind of a misnomer to call it a peninsula. There are mountains surrounding that there, and the river is the major part of the town. And then if you look where the upper left-hand side of the map of the town, that's where the steel mill was. And then if you look down right about where the word Leechburg is, maybe about halfway between there and where the river is, that's where the school was. Well, the school still is there. So the age breakdown of Leechburg is that the median age is 43 years, under 18 is 21%, 18 to 24 is 6.4%, 24 to 44 is 26.2, 45 to 64 is 22.5, and then 65 plus is 23%. There's another area where we see weird variance in age from the national average indicates poverty. The median age of the United States is 37.2 years, with under 18 being 25%, 18 to 24 being 9.6%, 24 to 44 being 30%, 45 to 64 being 22%, and then 65 plus being 12.4%. You will observe, and this is a matter of statistical significance, that in the United States, on average, in the 18 to 24 range and the 24 to 44 range, you see a pretty significant increase in the general United States compared to Leechburg, Pennsylvania. This indicates that people of working age are not living in Leechburg, right? It also, if you look at under 18, there is a bit of a discrepancy there, and that would indicate that people are choosing not to raise their children in Leechburg as well. Leechburg is not dramatically, but significantly older than the United States as a whole, namely because the people that choose to live there are people that grew up there. Now, it's hard to talk about when the town was actually prospering. Its most prosperous was about the 1910s. Leechburg was established as a coal town in the mid-1800s, and we can see on this historic population, the highest the population ever was in town was in 1950, but then it was pretty darn close to that in 1920 as well. Well, no, 1930. Okay, so we basically see the high point from 1920 to 1950 or so, and that checks out. So what was happening there is that build up to the 1920s, there was a coal mine in town, and the coal mine brought in people. And then in the 19 teens, the steel boom really took off in this portion of Pennsylvania, and that created jobs for people in the steel mills. And then we see from the 60s on a kind of consistent drop in population. That is because, first of all, the coal mine was entirely gone, and then by the 80s and to today, we see kind of a really kind of consistent decline with this data being from the late 2010s, the estimated population being just under 2,000 people. And that is what the town looks like. The town is about half empty, and those who are there don't have super great jobs if they have jobs. The steel industry in my childhood in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s was in severe decline. Prior to the decline, people did work their whole lives in the steel mills, and so people left high school. Sometimes they didn't even finish high school. They went into the steel mill and they retired out of the steel mill with a full pension. That era was absolutely ending as I was growing up, and we didn't know what was going to happen. It was a really good example, and in my environmental justice class, I talk about like an apocalypse is a social construct, right? The world ends for people all the time, and in my teenagedom, the world of Leechburg, Pennsylvania was pretty much ending, and now I guess you could almost call it post-apocalyptic. So our teachers in the late 90s were telling us that we would either be tool and die technicians or, quote, work with computers. The reality of the matter is, well, the tool and die technician thing just didn't happen. There's some people doing tool and die, but nothing could ever be what steel once was. And many of us, I mean, everyone does work with computers, but they didn't know what that meant, right? So they couldn't build the industry up to do it other than get some computers, whatever that means. And so those of us who could left, right? And many of those who stayed now have opiate addictions. That's a very real thing. And I'm not saying everyone has opiate addictions, but there's opioids are a major problem in places like Leechburg. Economic decline was well underway when I graduated from high school, and since I left, I suppose that I stopped living full-time in Leechburg in 2001, and that was a long time ago. But since then, there are even fewer jobs, and there are absolutely increased opiate addiction rates. In the period in the 2000s when the drug that the United States was most concerned with was methamphetamine, really heroin was always a problem in Leechburg, and since the opioid epidemic really has become like a cultural thing in all of the United States, it has only gotten worse in Leechburg. Leechburg also has problems with what's called brain drain. Occurs when an area lacks resources and opportunities, and the most intelligent and talented youth then leave when they actually get a chance. So when this occurs, recovery and adaptation are not possible because the best and brightest of the town are leaving, right? So the smart kids are leaving. Again, I'm not saying that there are no smart people in Leechburg. I'm saying, though, a lot of the smart people have left because there was no opportunity. And this problem is especially bad on American Indian reservations. For some time, Canada had a problem with this. in the early 2000s and 2010s. It's my understanding that Canada has kind of recovered that in building a lot of their university systems. To counter this phenomena, scholarships from certain areas often require people to return to that area for a given number of years after they receive their education. That is one way to combat brain drain. And it's easy for countries to do this because to move from one country to another, you need to give student visas and make a kind of deal that, yeah, we'll pay for this, but you have to come back. Small towns can't do that. Small towns don't have that funding, and as Americans, we can move anywhere in the country without any real ramifications. So it's a lot harder to do that kind of thing that countries can do in that way. We see the effects of brain drain in the size of Leechburg's graduating classes. In 1926, and 1976, and I marked this because this is when my mom graduated, and they did have the largest graduating class ever from Leechburg. 350 may not sound big for a lot of you, but it was for us. And then my graduating class in 2001 was 59 people. That was not necessarily the lowest, but that's about as low as it has been. And then in 2020, for reference, we had 70 graduates. And in terms of statistical significance, there's not so much difference between 59 and 70 people, but you really see that big jump. So that kind of is addressing some of the issues surrounding poverty, just what it looks like demographically. Now let's look at some of the popular conceptions of poverty. Poor people are often seen as having made poor life decisions. And these arguments are often based on folk wisdom and not backed with scientific evidence or really logical arguments that include evidence. In 1994, Herrnstein and Murray made an argument that poverty is a natural and unavoidable condition in society. This was called The Bell Curve. It was a very popular book of that era, and it did resonate with the American public, mainly because it backed up the status quo. People like it when they're told that their society is good, and it also matched a lot of the prevalent ideologies of that era. Namely, if we ignore race, if we just kind of keep going the way we are, if our corporate companies keep making money, then everything's going to be great. The bell curve argued that intelligence and talent was tied to how financially successful the individual was. And all factors being the same, human intelligence does tend to follow a normal distribution. That's what we call a bell curve, right? If you've taken a statistics class, you're very familiar with normal distributions. So from this perspective, the bell curve is arguing that poverty is something that we should expect because some people, from this perspective, have to be poor so that other people can be rich. Thus, those people who are poor, who are less intelligent, who are lazier, make less money. You see how this kind of goes in to all of the ideological components of how capitalism holds itself up. However, all factors are not the same. Sociologists never really bought into the whole bell curve thing. We explained that poverty is driven by powerful social phenomena outside of the power of the individual. It can include the era you were born in. If you were born in the baby boom generation, you definitely had greater access to resources and greater access to higher paying jobs than those of us who have been born after that. Bell curve thought does not include discrimination, right? It is assuming that everyone is just treated absolutely equally. It doesn't include race. It doesn't include family history. It is interesting that this is not backed up by the sociological data. This is a clumsy, basically economics and statistical analysis with very little understanding of sociological phenomena, namely being done by people that don't understand really human social science. I do want to point out that race and family history are discussed in the bell curve book, but it is incredibly clumsy, and it is it's racist is really what it comes down to. Additionally, from this perspective, the authors made the argument that the reasons why non-whites do not make as much money as whites is because they are genetically inferior in terms of IQ. And I promise you, this makes it sound like the 1990s intellectually was a long time ago, and it kind of was, but this is still kind of incredibly insulting from 1990 standards. It should be pointed out that IQ tests of that era have been found to be deeply racist, and if we include issues surrounding both the SAT and the ACT, those tests as well definitely had issues, namely with the ways the questions were worded that absolutely would favor people living in mainstream American culture as opposed to, say, kids of immigrants. And since the early 90s, the scientific validity of the concept of an IQ score has been deeply called into question. The overwhelming consensus among sociologists is that structural racism, not IQ, is the cause of the differences between life chances of whites and non-whites. And we've discussed structural racism in previous lectures. I would think probably if you were to break it all out, the number one lead of those indiscrepancies is that poor black school districts tend to get about the least funding in the United States. So thus, if the way you're measuring IQ is through ideas being taught in schools, if you don't go to a good school because of structural racism, then you would be more likely to be lower on that bell curve. Again, not because you're smarter, but because you just weren't taught things. Now let's talk about some cultural level explanations of poverty. How does our society try to explain this stuff? Again, not in an accurate way, but in a, well, kind of, how do we explain it? We've discussed culture of poverty. Many people who live in poverty live in communities where nearly everyone is poor. And these communities develop emotional and social mechanisms that help them cope with the hardships of poverty. However, these mechanisms do also backfire, and they can sometimes keep people from escaping poverty. Group membership theory, this is a new idea for our lectures, states that young people need to see examples to show them what positive behavior actually is and what it actually isn't. And for this reason, young people need positive role models. And this is pretty well understood in our society. And there are like after-school programs that help disadvantaged kids, and they do a great thing. Furthermore, if one's peers show little motivation to graduate from high school, it will negatively impact academic efforts, and this is compounded by lack of role models. Basically, teens are very highly susceptible to reject family for their peers because their brains are trying to figure out how to be adult, right? Their brains are figuring out how to move away from their families, and thus they look to their friends on how to act. And if their friends do not value education, if their friends do not value intellectualism, then they will not, even if they are rather smart, they'll pretend that they're not. And this is very similar to what we find in criminology in a set of theories called differential association theory. Basically, you will pick up those tendencies that your friend groups pick up. And that is the end of this lecture. If you need anything, please send me an email.